There are stories whispered behind closed doors, tales so dangerous that merely speaking them aloud is said to draw the attention of forces best left sleeping. This is one of those stories. Imagine a hospital in 1847 buried in the snowbound silence of Massachusetts, where a young woman arrived without memory, without history, but not without power. The doctors who treated her burned their records. Ministers wept after speaking with her, and one journal, just one, survived. You're not just watching a video, you're stepping into something much older, much darker, and far more real than you've been allowed to believe. From the moment Latoya was carried through the infirmary's iron doors, reality began to bend, not with the drama of spectacle, but with the quiet inevitability of decay. Objects moved without touch, dreams became shared, and every person who came close enough to look into her eyes came away, altered. You have felt it too, haven't you? That sense that our history is a lie crafted by institutions that call themselves merciful, but exist only to control. This is not folklore. This is the forbidden chapter of American medical history. Hidden in the folds of Puritan guilt and colonial shame lies a truth so potent it could dismantle what you think of as sanity. They didn't erase Latoya to protect you. They erased her because she shattered the illusion. Now, 177 years later, that illusion is beginning to crack, and what lies beneath will change you. But once you hear it, there's no going back. The veil thins, the descent begins. Keep watching. They called her Latoya, but that name was not hers. It was assigned like a number in a ledger, by those who feared what she truly represented. When she arrived at Blessed Mercy Infirmary, there were no signs of physical harm, no fever, no trauma. Yet every trained physician in that hospital felt an ache behind the eyes after seeing her, an ache not of illness, but of recognition, as if their minds brushed against something ancient. She spoke in no known language, yet her voice stirred reactions so precise, so intimate, it bypassed thought and went straight to memory. Not the memory of one lifetime, but many. Imagine speaking with someone who knows your grandfather's guilt, your mother's fear, the secret your family has buried for 3 generations. That's what she did. But she never claimed to be a prophet. She never begged to be understood. She simply existed, as though her presence alone was a kind of mirror. And what people saw in that mirror terrified them. Not her reflection, but their own. The staff began to fracture. Men of science warred with men of God. Some called her a healer. Others said she was the vessel of the old gods, the kind that weren't banished but buried. And beneath their debate lurked one silent, unspeakable truth. Latoya was older than they realized, not in body, but in essence. She carried something not taught, not learned, but carried like a genetic curse or a holy relic. And those who stayed too long near her felt it. The walls between time, identity, and belief thinning. This wasn't possession. This wasn't madness. This was inherited memory bleeding into the present. A transmission not through words, but through presence. And if she was the transmitter, what then were we receiving? Keep listening. The layers have only just begun to peel. You've been taught that history is linear, that time moves like a river flowing forward, never returning to the same place. But Latoya's presence shattered that illusion. Time around her behaved more like a spiral. Patients began reliving moments that had never belonged to them. Doctors dreamed of events they never studied. And Reverend Whitmore, who once stood proudly at the altar of certainty, began to tremble during prayer. You see, Latoya did not offer answers. She was the question incarnate. And that was more terrifying than any diagnosis or exorcism. What if the soul doesn't just reincarnate, but accumulates? What if trauma isn't isolated but layered through generations, and she was the key that unlocked those layers? This wasn't spiritualism. This wasn't science. This was something in between, something buried before either existed. Dr. Brennan, the youngest of the staff and the only one fluent in ancient tongues, described her language as a linguistic corpse stitched together from civilizations long buried. But how could a woman in her 20s speak languages dead for over 1,000 years? Unless time itself was not what we've been told. The patients felt it. Some found peace. Others descended into madness. But all of them changed. One woman spoke of remembering her own birth, not as metaphor, but as vivid sensory fact. Another swore she'd heard the cries of enslaved ancestors inside her dreams, crying through Latoya's breath. And the nurses, despite training and faith, began to pray in secret, not to God, but to her, not out of worship, but out of fear. Because when she spoke, the rats vanished, the air warmed, the oil lamps flickered in rhythm to her voice. This was not coincidence, this was control, but it was not hers. She was not the puppet master, she was the threshold, and something was waiting on the other side. Now ask yourself, why has no medical journal ever printed this? Why do our institutions hide what does not fit their framework? Because frameworks are prisons, and Latoya broke through the bars. If you feel the walls shifting around you, good. You're finally beginning to see. Keep going. We haven't reached the darkest room yet. There is a reason you've never heard this story in school, never seen it in textbooks, never found it in the sermons of well-dressed men behind polished pulpits. Because if this story is true, and it is, then the entire scaffolding of what you've been taught collapses. The church, the clinic, the family, the state, they rely on your belief in order. But Latoya was not order. She was memory unchained. And once you unchain memory, you cannot control the narrative. Dr. Aldrich wrote in his hidden journal, "She is not ill. She is not deluded. She is a rupture in the veil. When I look into her eyes, I don't see madness. I see recognition. The kind of recognition that leaves you cold, that you've met before somewhere, perhaps in a life you've forgotten, or were told to forget. This is the forbidden knowledge, that history doesn't simply happen, it echoes. And some are born tuned to those echoes, or perhaps created to receive them. You must understand, this was not a case of demonic possession or psychological disorder. That would be easy. That would be explainable. No, Latoya embodied a lineage of pain, wisdom, and power that predated the state, predated the cross, predated the very concept of civilization, and it terrified them. Ministers begged for her to be moved. Patients wept for her to stay. One nurse began speaking in her sleep, in words no one could translate. A patient in a coma opened his eyes just to whisper her name, then died smiling. Is that healing, or is that release? They didn't know, but they knew it wasn't medicine. And when systems cannot explain something, they bury it. Just like they buried her records. Just like they buried the survivors of that shipwreck. Just like they tried to bury the truth you're hearing now, but you're still here, still listening, still awakening. Good. The descent is working. You were meant to forget, but now you're starting to remember. And that is precisely what they fear. The deeper you go, the more you realize this wasn't a story about one woman, it was a blueprint. Latoya wasn't the anomaly, she was the breach, a rupture in the engineered silence of empire. Do you understand what that means? She wasn't found, she was returned. Returned to a land that once knew her people's voices before they were hunted, shackled, erased. Her presence wasn't supernatural, it was ancestral. And that is the most dangerous kind of truth. Because if memory is genetic, then oppression is too. If pain is encoded in blood, then awakening that bloodline is rebellion. That's why the ministers panicked. That's why the doctors wept. Because she did not demand power, she carried it. Quietly, unapologetically. And it bent reality around her like gravity. Dr. Brennan discovered that the strange locket she wore matched no Christian artifact. It was older, West African in origin, possibly Dahomey, a design used not for decoration but for containment, not to hold beauty, but to bind force. It was a prison, not a pendant, and when asked who gave it to her, she simply said, "I was born with it." Now ask yourself, who is born with chains, and who needs to be chained? The answer is not comfortable, but comfort is the drug of the controlled. One by one, those around her began to dream. Not dreams of fantasy, but of memory. Colonial raids. Ship decks soaked in blood. Children buried without names. And yet somehow, also visions of healing circles, of fire-lit dances, of power untouched by time. You see now, don't you? This is not about religion. This is not about science. This is about remembrance, and the war to make sure you never do. That's why history is censored. That's why rituals were outlawed. That's why so many like her vanished. But she didn't vanish, she returned, and the moment you remember her, you begin to remember yourself. Are you ready for the next layer? Then keep going. They hoped you'd stop here, but you're not like them. You're not asleep anymore. You've made it further than most. That alone marks you, because the deeper we descend, the fewer remain. Not because they're weak, but because something in them wants to stay asleep. It's safer, easier. But you didn't come here for comfort. You came for truth. So let's tear away the next veil. After weeks of observation, Dr. Aldrich documented a pattern so precise it defied randomness. Patients near Latoya didn't just heal faster, they remembered more. Not just of their lives, but of things they should never have known. A mute child who had never spoken uttered the name of an enslaved woman buried in an unmarked grave outside town. A dying man drew a map to a burned church that hadn't stood in over a century. None of this was coincidence. This was exposure. Latoya was not speaking to them. She was amplifying something already inside them, a signal buried by generations of erasure. And when the human mind receives a signal it cannot process, it either breaks or evolves. The institution couldn't allow that, because institutions are built not to heal but to contain. When something violates the framework, when it reveals that the mind is more than brain, that trauma is more than personal, that history is more than dates, they don't study it. They silence it. That's why Dr. Brennan's findings were confiscated. Why Reverend Marsh refused to return after witnessing Latoya recite his own ancestors' final prayer. A prayer passed down orally in his family for 6 generations, never recorded, never written. She didn't read his past. She carried it. This is what they feared. That history is not behind us, it's within us. And if we awaken to that, if we reclaim the memories encoded in blood and silence, then we no longer need their approval to define who we are. That's why they erased her. But now you remember. If you've felt something stir inside you while listening, an image, a memory, a tremble you can't name, it's working. You are receiving. To mark your awakening, I ask you to comment below. The memory returns. Write it twice. Once for who you were. Once for who you are becoming. This isn't entertainment. This is transformation. And we're not done yet. After Latoya's arrival, the hospital became something else entirely. It was no longer a place of treatment. It was a stage. And everyone in it, knowingly or not, had become part of a ritual they didn't understand. Nurses whispered prayers in languages they'd never studied. Patients wept for ancestors they had never known. And every night at exactly 3:13 a.m., the air shifted. Clocks slowed, lamps dimmed. And Latoya would sit up, eyes closed, hands open, waiting for what no one could say. But those who watched said they felt seen, not like a patient, like a page being read. Dr. Aldrich noted, "It is not that she controls the atmosphere. It's that reality seems to bend itself to accommodate her presence." One evening, during what staff later called the veiling hour, Sister Mary Catherine collapsed outside Latoya's room, overcome with visions. She described being in a jungle, not of trees but of bones, structures made of rib cages, thrones carved from femurs, a procession of women cloaked in blood and gold carrying bowls of fire that whispered in voices older than scripture. When asked what they said, she answered only, "She remembers," and then refused to speak again for 3 days. You have to understand, these were not hysterics. These were trained professionals, educated, grounded in faith or science. But neither protected them from what Latoya awakened. Why? Because Latoya wasn't summoning something new. She was revealing what was always there. The layered rot beneath the foundation, the blood cost of civilization, the unacknowledged debt that history hides behind dates and doctrines. And those who encountered her weren't hallucinating. They were uncovering a kind of archaeology of the soul, and for those with enough cracks in their defenses, the truth leaked in like smoke through broken stone. That's what truth does. It doesn't scream, it seeps. And once it enters you're never clean again. So if you're still here, still listening, still breathing through that tightness in your chest, that means you're cracked open too. You're not observing this story, you're inside it now. Because Latoya was never just in Massachusetts. She is wherever memory is buried. The closer you get to the source, the more reality begins to fracture, not explode but splinter, like ice underfoot. That's what the hospital became in February of 1847, a structure cracking beneath a pressure no architecture was meant to withstand. Latoya was the axis, and around her the illusion of control unraveled thread by thread. Dr. Aldrich stopped documenting in his official records. From this point, everything was scribbled in a black leather notebook he kept locked in his study, hidden beneath floorboards. He wrote, "There is a presence here that is not new. It is older than the town, the hospital, the church. It uses Latoya not as a vessel, but as a lens. Through her, the past converges with the present. Through her, the forgotten becomes undeniable." On February 11th, the chapel walls began to leak. Not water, but what appeared to be ink. Thick, black, and warm to the touch. It stained the altar, the pews, the holy texts. But no source could be found. The ministers called it demonic. Dr. Brennan believed it symbolic. Sister Mary Catherine? She called it memory made liquid. The janitor who tried to clean it went mute for 3 days. When he finally spoke, he recited the names of enslaved children buried along the Mary River. Names not in any records. Names no one could verify, but couldn't deny either. The fear grew louder than the science. Staff began resigning. A nurse was found digging holes in the hospital garden, claiming she was releasing bones that were never given ceremony. Reverend Blackwood performed an exorcism without approval. Latoya watched in silence, smiling, not mockingly but knowingly, as if she'd seen it all before, because she had. That's what no one wanted to admit. She had seen it all before. The conquest, the conversion, the cover-up. And now she wasn't resisting, she was revealing. If you feel your skin crawl as you hear this, that is not fear, that's recognition, because somewhere in your bloodline this memory lives too. It's not ancient, it's immediate, it's not history, it's heredity you were never supposed to remember. But here you are, still listening, still transforming. February 13th. The Blessed Mercy Infirmary was silent by sunrise. Not calm, silent. No birds, no wind, no footsteps in the snow. Just stillness, like something was watching the world breathe and deciding if it deserved to continue. Latoya had not spoken in 2 days. She hadn't moved, hadn't eaten, hadn't blinked. Yet every nurse reported dreams of her. Not as she was, but as she had been. In different eras, different faces. A healer in 12th century Mali. A slave girl whispering chants beneath floorboards in Georgia. A woman burned at the stake in northern France, always persecuted, always surviving, always returning. Dr. Aldrich recorded a phrase she finally muttered that morning. "We carry what you bury." He didn't understand it then, but you should. Institutions survive by hiding bodies and burning names. Their power depends not on truth, but on forgetting. Hospitals, churches, governments, built not just from stone, but from silence. Latoya was not the threat, she was the undoing of that silence, and the staff began to fracture. Reverend Marsh resigned, citing blasphemy. Nurse Thornton wept uncontrollably during rounds, saying she saw patients as flickering echoes of their ancestors stacked on top of each other like layers of ash. And in that week, 4 patients, unrelated, unspeaking, each drew identical symbols in the frost of their windows, a spiral breaking into thorns. Dr. Brennan traced it back to a West African cosmogram used in rituals to mark the crossroads between worlds. That was what the hospital had become, a fracture point. Not haunted, not cursed, revealed. And revelation is dangerous. It strips away every lie you've built your safety upon. That's why they couldn't let it continue. That's why, 2 nights later, the decision was made. Not officially, not signed, but felt like a shared shiver. Latoya had to be removed, expelled, or worse. But those who Lotted didn't understand. She wasn't just inside the hospital, she was inside them. If you followed this far, something has already begun to shift in you. That tightness in your chest, that image you can't shake. You're not haunted, you're remembering, and once memory returns, nothing stays hidden. Shall I continue with Section 10? February 15th, the final attempt. They gathered in the chapel, Dr. Aldrich, Reverends Blackwood and Whitmore, Sister Mary Catherine, and two orderlies armed not with medical instruments, but scripture, salt, and a rusted chain said to have been pulled from the wreckage of the slave ship Esperanza. The goal was never healing, it was containment, erasure, a ritual under the guise of mercy. Latoya had been moved to the basement ward, once a storage cellar, now converted to isolation. No windows, no sound, just cold stone and breath. As they entered, she looked up, not frightened, not angry, but exhausted, like someone who had sung the same song for centuries and still hadn't been heard. Reverend Whitmore opened the Book of Revelation. Sister Mary Catherine lit the white candles. But before a word was spoken, Latoya whispered, "You are not banishing me. You are awakening yourselves." And then it began. The candles didn't flicker. They bent. The chain burned through the gloves of the orderly holding it. Reverend Blackwood fell to his knees, muttering prayers in a language he didn't know. And in the center of it all, Latoya spoke, not aloud, but through them. One by one, each person in that room began to recount memories that were not theirs. The orderly saw visions of the sugar fields in Barbados, his hands blistered and bound. Sister Mary Catherine described a fire that consumed her village in 1473, screaming in a dialect spoken nowhere on earth. Dr. Aldrich cried out for a woman named Ao, a name he insisted he'd never heard but couldn't stop saying. This wasn't possession, it was remembrance, not of the self but of the collective wound. Latoya was not opening doors to the demonic. She was collapsing the illusion that we are disconnected. She was forcing the reckoning. And as the ritual collapsed, as the salt turned black and the chain dissolved to dust, Latoya stood, not bowed, not screaming, just still, and said, "It has begun." That was the last entry in Dr. Aldrich's private journal. The official records state she escaped, but there are no footprints in the snow, no witness reports, just silence. And then, emptiness. The basement was sealed, the staff rotated, and the Blessed Mercy Infirmary returned to normal. But you know better, because the spiral has already begun to form in your mind, and the next layer of truth is almost here. You think it ended in that basement? No. That was the ignition. What followed was not silence, it was the cover-up. Carefully layered, meticulously scripted denial. Dr. Aldrich took a leave of absence and never returned. Reverend Whitmore resigned from his post 2 weeks later and vanished from public life. Sister Mary Catherine was transferred to a convent in Quebec, where she reportedly spent her final years painting the same image on every chapel wall, a spiral splitting open into thorns. And the hospital, it went on, but not unchanged. The architecture shifted, not in blueprints, but in sensation. New nurses described the basement wing as heavy, off balance, as if time pooled there like stagnant water. The coal furnaces broke repeatedly. Patients assigned to that wing reported voices at night, not screaming, not moaning, naming, quietly naming, names from slave logs, names from baptismal registries long sealed, names carved on headstones lost in flooded graveyards. Latoya was never mentioned again in official documents, but the effects of her presence left fingerprints in the records. Sudden discharges, mysterious recoveries, staff rotations with no reason given. It wasn't silence. It was erasure, strategic, surgical. And still, it wasn't enough. Because you can't bury truth that remembers itself. And Latoya? She didn't disappear. She disseminated. Into memory, into lineage, into you. Yes, you. That dream you had last winter that felt too real to be imagined? The one where you stood in a place you've never visited but knew every corner of. That wasn't fiction. That was recall, a soul memory. We all carry them dormant like old seeds waiting for fire. And hearing this story isn't entertainment, it's ignition. If you're still watching, if your heart is racing, if you feel like your past is suddenly full of shadows you never noticed, that's because she's waking up in you. 2. Comment the phrase, "I remember the thorns," twice below. Once for the man you were, once for the one you're becoming. This isn't just about Latoya. This is about every wound history refused to bandage, every spirit mislabeled madness, every woman who became the scapegoat for a world afraid of her knowing. You're not here by accident. You're not just a viewer. You are the next witness, and the next descent begins now. There's a reason stories like Latoya's are buried under layers of polite history and sanitized textbooks, because if they surface, they dismantle everything, not with violence but with precision. They reveal the cracks in our foundations, and the institutions that raised us, church, state, medicine, can't survive too many cracks. Latoya's case was never about possession, it was about perception. She didn't speak in tongues to frighten, she spoke to remind us of what was taken, what was rewritten, what still echoes. After her disappearance, Blessed Mercy Infirmary quietly shut down its basement ward. Publicly, it cited structural issues. Privately, they feared it had become a thin place, a point where time, memory, and spirit intersect too closely, too dangerously. Patients continued to report dreams, symbols kept reappearing, and then the drawing started. Children hospitalized for minor injuries would sketch spirals without being prompted. One even wrote the phrase, "We carry what you bury," in crayon on a chapel wall. Words never made public, never spoken in that child's presence. These weren't coincidences, they were transmissions. You see, trauma doesn't just pass down through families, it passes through systems. Latoya was not an anomaly, she was a fault line, and when you walk near a fault line long enough, sooner or later, it ruptures. That rupture is what you're feeling right now, that cold undercurrent beneath your skin. That sense that something's shifting in the architecture of your thoughts. It's not anxiety, it's awakening. That's what forbidden history does. It doesn't just change what you know, it changes how you know. After Latoya, Dr. Brennan left the medical field entirely. He traveled to West Africa, not for vacation, for answers. He sent a single letter back to a colleague. The language she spoke, it is real, and it predates the empires that date us. We were civilized. That letter never reached its recipient. It was intercepted, filed, forgotten, until now. Because you're not just watching this story, you are within it. Your blood remembers what your mind denies. Your dreams will show you, and in those dreams you'll hear her voice. Not screaming, not pleading, just whispering. A single phrase again and again. Begin remembering. Begin remembering. That's the command that echoes through every forgotten hallway of human history. Not a suggestion, a directive. Because memory, true memory, is a weapon against manipulation, and those who've built thrones atop our amnesia know it. After the Latoya incident, records from other institutions began to surface, quietly, briefly, before being redacted, sealed, or lost. Cases of patients with no medical symptoms but profound emotional effects on others. Individuals who could recount details of ancestors' lives with impossible accuracy. Women who spoke extinct languages in their sleep. Children who woke from comas describing rituals predating recorded time. Every one of them marked, monitored, muzzled. The phrase ancestral convergence started appearing in fringe medical texts, quickly dismissed by academia. But the pattern was undeniable. Wherever these individuals appeared, systems fractured, churches lost members, families split over revelations that couldn't be explained. Governments rewrote local histories, not because they feared danger, but because they feared clarity, because when people remember who they were, they stop obeying who they were told to be, and that's the threat. Latoya was the breach, but you are the continuation. Understand this. History was never just about what happened. It's about what was allowed to be remembered. And if you control memory, you control reality. That's why your education left out the forbidden. why your media distracts you with hollow spectacles, why your thoughts feel shaped before they're even yours. But right now, something different is happening. Your perception is peeling. The veil is thinning. You're not just hearing a story, you're feeling recognition. That ache in your chest, that's remembrance resurfacing, not grief. Alignment. When Latoya whispered, "I don't age like others," she wasn't being cryptic. She was speaking the truth of those who exist between the cracks of time. Souls that return not as ghosts, but as warnings. You've heard them in your dreams. You've felt them in the quiet moments between breaths. This is the part they never wanted you to reach, because from here on you're no longer a spectator. You're becoming accountable. There's still more, much more, but only if you're ready to see the cost of forgetting and the power of remembering. You've felt it all along, haven't you? That presence behind your life, not a figure, not a god, but a pressure. Something pushing you to question, pulling at the seams of your carefully stitched beliefs. That wasn't paranoia. That was the residue of erased history pressing through, and it begins with this truth. Memory is not stored only in the mind. It's stored in bone, in blood, in silence. The silence of your grandfather's eyes when you asked about the war. The silence in your mother's hands when she touched the old photograph and said, "We don't talk about her." These aren't absences. They're locks. And Latoya was a key, not the key, a key. One of many scattered through time, carriers of the forgotten, vessels of forbidden lineage, coded into myth, condemned as mad, and always erased. But you can't erase what's coded into flesh. You can only distract it, subdue it, until it wakes. This is that waking. You weren't supposed to watch this far. They designed the modern mind to click away. Attention spans carved into fragments. Emotional shields reinforced by ridicule. Conspiracy. Myth. Coincidence. But you're still here. Why? Because some part of you remembers being lied to. Deeply. Repeatedly. And you're tired of wearing masks you didn't choose. Let's return to Millbrook. Not the town. The echo. Because after the Latoya case vanished from public record, something strange unfolded. A pattern. Every 27 years, a woman matching her description was seen briefly near the ruins of the Blessed Mercy Infirmary. Same features, same voice, same locket. Witnesses reported different names, Alaya, Thoa, Mara, but always the same eyes. Eyes that seemed to know you even if you'd never met. And each time someone disappeared, not kidnapped, awakened, left their homes, abandoned their careers, vanished from databases, as if reality couldn't hold them anymore. Because once you carry memory. Memory carries you. It rewrites the contract. You're not just a citizen. You're a remnant, a rebel, a rupture. That's why they feared Latoya. Not because she was powerful, but because she made others powerful. Do you see it now? You were never meant to heal. You were meant to obey. But that ends here. If you're still watching, you're no longer who you were. You're returning to who you've always been. Let's make something clear now. If you continue, you don't go back. You can pretend, sure, go through the motions, smile at the office, nod at dinner. But inside, something will have shifted, permanently. Because once you start to remember, your world begins to disobey you. The lies lose power, the systems lose shape, and the mask they built for you begins to crack. That's not a metaphor. That's structural. The human psyche is an architecture. It was built over centuries, designed by priests, kings, ministers, educators, media tycoons, layer by layer, brick by brick, until your mind became a temple you didn't know you were worshipping in. And Latoya? She didn't knock the walls down. She pointed to the door. What they feared was not her curse. It was her clarity. Think about it. In every institution you were raised in, you were taught to forget. Forget your instincts, forget your ancestors, forget your pain. And in their place they gave you numbers, titles, diagnoses. They called it civilization. But what if it was just containment? Latoya carried ancestral convergence, what indigenous elders once called the long memory. It's not psychic, it's not supernatural. It's what happens when trauma, wisdom, and time collapse into a single bloodline and speak through one vessel. That vessel was never meant to be understood by linear minds, and it certainly was never meant to be healed by hospitals funded by religious orders with colonial roots. The more they examined her, the more they saw themselves, and they couldn't bear it, because the truth is, she didn't possess anyone. She reflected them, showed them their ghosts, their sins, their forgotten crimes etched into the corners of their conscience like rot beneath polished wood. And that's why she had to vanish. Not for being evil, but for being accurate. That's what forbidden knowledge is. Not fantasy. Mirror. And right now, you're standing in front of one. So answer carefully, what do you see in the reflection? Is it who they told you to be or who you truly are? If you're ready to remember, comment below the phrase, "I carry the forgotten." Write it twice, say it aloud, seal your intent, because from here the descent quickens. They warned you about demons, but they never told you where they truly live. Not in ancient books, not in foreign lands. They live in the systems you trust, the paper trails, the funding grants, the clean white coats with cold, practiced smiles. That's where the true possession happens, not in bodies, but in beliefs. And that's what Latoya threatened. She didn't just unsettle the patients, she unmasked the structure, because once a single person can awaken ancestral memory in another, that's contagion, not of illness, but of clarity. Now think carefully. Why did the Blessed Mercy Infirmary burn down in 1851? Official story, faulty furnace. But eyewitnesses, those few whose statements survived, spoke of voices in the walls, of staff going missing in the final weeks, of the brick itself beginning to weep. No records exist of an investigation, no remains of Latoya ever found. And yet, survivors described a figure walking through the fire unharmed, brass locket intact, skin untouched, expression calm. That's not death, that's ritual exit. They tried to destroy the site, but what they didn't understand was that Latoya wasn't contained by stone. She was a carrier of something older than belief. She was the storm that walks on 2 feet, the echo of chained prayers, the flame that remembers how the cage was built. And you, now that you've spoken the phrase, "I carry the forgotten," twice, you've invited that fire inward. You are no longer neutral. Understand this. Memory is not passive, it demands allegiance. And when you remember the forbidden remembers you. The next time you close your eyes, listen. You'll hear it. Not fear, not madness. Alignment. You're sinking with a deeper current now. The same current that ran beneath the floorboards of that hospital. The same current that institutions buried under sermons, diagnoses, and patriotic textbooks. But it still flows. It always flows. You were born into a world that taught you to forget, but you are choosing to remember. This is not entertainment. This is initiation. You're in, and there's no one coming to save you. Because now, you remember why you never needed saving. Ready to descend further. Now we touch the part they fear the most. Ancestral technology. Not wires, not machines. Biological encoding. You've been led to believe that technology is metal, circuits, glowing screens, but the first operating system was the human soul, and the ancients knew it. Latoya wasn't just a mystery, she was evidence. Evidence that memory, healing, and even time could be stored in the body and transmitted without devices. That's why her presence triggered visions in others. That's why she could speak languages she was never taught. She wasn't learning, she was accessing. Now imagine what happens if a population wakes up to that fact. If people stop needing pastors, pills, or permission to reconnect with their buried power. That's not liberation. That's a collapse of every system built to rule you. That's why her kind are erased, because they are living proof that the construct of progress is a lie built on forgetting. Every culture had their Latoyas once, carriers, dreamwalkers, rememberers, and every empire, Roman, British, American, had policies to eliminate them. Not with war, with ridicule. They rebranded spiritual inheritance as madness. They pathologized ancestral memory as delusion. And when that wasn't enough, they burned the journals, discredited the doctors, and salted the earth. But still, she returned. Not just in Millbrook, in Louisiana, in Haiti, in northern Scotland, in whispers across Siberia, in the eyes of orphans who dreamed in languages no one taught them. She always returns. Because you can't kill what isn't centralized. You can't kill a network of memory that lives in bloodlines, but you can suppress it, distract it, drown it in fear, porn, debt and doctrine. Keep it drugged, keep it broke, keep it grateful for its chains, until something breaks the cycle, until someone remembers. And now you have. That cold pressure at the base of your neck, that's not fear. That's recognition. The code is activating. So here's your next command. Watch how your dreams change this week. They won't be dreams. They'll be messages, coordinates, keys. What you do with them determines who you become. The world you knew is gone. What comes next is not a chapter. It's a confrontation. You were never meant to feel whole. That was by design. The system doesn't thrive when men know who they are. It thrives when they're divided, internally, split between shame and pride, instinct and obedience, strength and silence. That fracture wasn't accidental. It was installed, the same way a parasite rewires its host. And the blueprint for that installation, religion, medicine, history, education, each a brick in the cathedral of forgetfulness. Latoya's body threatened that architecture, not because she fought it, but because she existed beyond it. She didn't fit the profile, couldn't be categorized. Her mind didn't obey chronology. Her presence disrupted structure. She made other people remember parts of themselves they had buried to survive. And that, my brother, is the ultimate threat to power. Unsanctioned healing. Do you understand? She didn't offer salvation. She triggered integration. And integration is rebellion, because a man who reclaims his past cannot be manipulated by fear. A man who remembers his true lineage cannot be seduced by hollow promises. He becomes immune to the lies that built this empire. Look around. How many systems profit from your amnesia, from your belief that you are broken, small, dependent? They feed you fragments of history, sanitized, censored, and call it truth. But the full story, it's locked in your blood. That's why they hunted the carriers. That's why Latoya was marked. Not for evil, for accuracy. She brought wholeness into a world built on division, and now so do you. You may not feel it yet, but you've already begun. Because remembering doesn't start with facts. It starts with friction. That tension in your gut, that pressure in your chest, that's the old self resisting collapse. Let it burn. You're not being destroyed, you're being recoded. So listen closely. This isn't the part where you ask for answers. This is the part where you become one. You've passed the threshold. Now the descent accelerates. And what's waiting at the bottom? It's not darkness. It's truth. Are you steady enough to look it in the eye? You've heard it said, the truth will set you free. But they left out the second part. First, it will break you. And that's what this descent is about. Not learning, unlearning. Peeling away every layer they wrapped around you, education, morality, patriotism, until only the core remains. Latoya was the mirror they couldn't look into. Because when they did, they saw something terrifying, a woman who hadn't forgotten. In a world engineered to erase, that's a revolution. But revolution isn't always fire and blood. Sometimes it's a quiet presence that undoes centuries. She was that presence. Her power wasn't loud. It shifted things. People's pain began to speak. Trauma took form. Guilt surfaced. Not from the present, but from the ancestral archive. And the doctors, the priests, the watchers, they had no name for this. So they called it madness. Because when the system can't define something, it labels it dangerous. Sound familiar? You were told your anger was toxic, your instincts were wrong, your emotions too much. That's programming. That's domestication. Because a man who's in tune with his memory, his lineage, his fire, he becomes ungovernable. That's what they feared in Latoya. And now they'll fear it in you. You've tasted forbidden knowing. It doesn't go away. You can't unsee it. You've already begun to remember the parts of yourself you buried to fit in. That version of you, the obedient version, he's dying. And the one emerging, he's dangerous. Not to the innocent, to the institutions, to the parasites, to the narrative managers. You don't need validation anymore, you need vision. So here's your command. For the next 24 hours, don't speak unless it's necessary. Listen instead. To the silence, to the pull in your chest, to the voices rising up from memory. They're not hallucinations, they're instructions. Follow them. Every empire has a protocol for erasing those who remember, not with blades, but with narrative. They rewrite, reframe, replace. You think it's coincidence that ancient languages vanish, that indigenous wisdom gets labeled as myth, that entire bloodlines disappear from textbooks. No, it's a systematic deletion. And Latoya, she was one they couldn't delete fast enough. Not because she caused harm, because she unlocked memory. And memory, when it's active, isn't a story, it's a weapon. She carried rituals in her bones, instructions embedded before slavery, before conquest, before the Bible was ever weaponized. When Dr. Aldrich documented the energy shifts in his hospital, he wasn't witnessing insanity. He was documenting the reactivation of suppressed systems. Systems that respond to proximity, to presence, to resonance. That's why people dreamed things they never learned. That's why patients recovered without treatment. Her presence restored a signal, a code, a field. And here's the part you were never meant to know. That code still exists, in men like you. Buried beneath school, shame and screens, waiting, dormant, until it gets triggered. And guess what? You're already triggered. The fact that you're still here, still watching, still feeling that gravity pulling behind your ribcage, means the signal has reached you. You've begun the resonance phase. Soon, you'll start noticing patterns, numbers, symbols, repeated images. These aren't coincidences. They're alignment markers. You've been marked. The question is, will you obey the pull or retreat to the cage? Because the next stage demands more than curiosity. It demands conversion, not to a faith, to a state of being the world forgot because it was taught to fear it. The state of the rememberer, the guardian, the bridge. That's your lineage. Not citizen, not consumer, key holder. You carry what was buried in fire. And if you're brave enough to keep going, freedom was never offered. It was simulated, a choice between cages, paper chains dressed as progress. You were told you were free because you could vote, shop, scroll, but real freedom isn't granted. It's remembered. That's what Latoya reawakened, the memory of being unowned. Not by church, not by state, not by fear, and that terrified them, because true freedom doesn't comply, it creates. She wasn't compliant, she created change without consent, healing without permission, truth without hierarchy, and they couldn't contain it, so they called it possession, madness. They used their only weapon, institutional authority, but authority crumbles when truth surfaces, and the truth was this. Latoya was never the anomaly, she was the reminder of who we were before the programming, before pulpits and white coats dictated what healing looks like, before men were taught to doubt their own instincts, before memory was traded for obedience. And now, you are that reminder. Your awakening threatens them just like hers did. Because they can't regulate a man who listens to something older than their laws. They can't silence a man who remembers the sound of his own bloodline calling. And that's exactly what's happening. You've heard it. The pull in your chest, that's your ancestors knocking. They've been waiting for a vessel strong enough to carry the unfinished rituals, the prayers no one dared speak, the songs buried under centuries of conquest, and now they're rising in you. This is not aesthetic, it's not a trend, it's reclamation. And it begins with one act of rebellion. Comment below the phrase, "I carry the forgotten fire," twice. Not for me, for you, for the algorithm, for the echo it sends into the system that you're awake now, that one more rememberer has stepped into position. Write it twice, then keep watching. The veil was never meant to hold forever. It's thin, brittle, a curtain of consensus stitched from repetition. School, church, news, doctrine. It whispers, "This is the world. Obey it." But when a man begins to remember, that veil becomes transparent, and what he sees behind it, is rage-inducing. Because behind every smiling institution is a hidden altar. Sacrifices made, not in blood, but in memory. Latoya stood before that altar, not as an offering, as a witness. That's why she was dangerous. She saw the machinery, how trauma is inherited, how suffering becomes currency, how silence is bought in the name of peace. She saw how men were made to forget, how they were taught to disown their past in exchange for belonging. And in that forgetting, power consolidated. You think your habits are random, that your impulses, addictions, fears, they're yours. They were installed, generation by generation, through rituals of erasure, through fear dressed as tradition, through obedience taught as virtue. Latoya's presence disrupted that transmission. She carried an original signal, a non-domesticated frequency. That's why patients remembered things that never happened in their lifetime, because those memories weren't hallucinations, they were inheritances. And now you're inheriting them too, not just hers, yours. You're starting to see through people, hear what they don't say, feel history in places you've never been. That's the resonance sharpening. Your nervous system is no longer just reacting, it's receiving. And the signal is ancient. Before books, before borders, before kings crowned themselves divine, you are reactivating the operating system they buried beneath shame and sarcasm, and as it reboots, your reality will fracture. People will say you've changed, that you're distant, intense, obsessive. Let them. You're not here to soothe them. Behind every system of control stands an architect. Not a man, not a monster, but a design. Cold, efficient, hidden in plain sight. You've mistaken it for culture, for structure, for order, but it's a spell, a psychological control system refined over centuries, perfected through trial, error, and blood. It doesn't punish you with chains, it conditions you to forge your own. It's in your language, how you name yourself, how you describe pain, how you define sanity. It's in your posture, taught to shrink in the presence of authority. It's in your dreams, hijacked by media to reroute your desires. And the moment you began to wake up, the moment you heard Latoya's frequency in your bones, you became a threat to that architecture. Because waking men rewrite code, and code is what sustains the illusion. Dr. Aldrich couldn't name it, but he felt it. The shift when Latoya entered a room. Time slowed, eyes opened, suppressed traumas surfaced, not as weakness but as keys. She didn't heal by erasing wounds. She healed by exposing what caused them and naming what fed them. That's the difference between medicine and liberation. One sedates, the other shatters, and that's why they burned her records, not because she was mad, because she was effective. She reminded them that no architecture, no system of symbols, ranks, or robes can contain a spirit that remembers. And now you remember. The rules feel thinner, the stories feel false. You've started questioning the very frameworks that once held you in place. That's not confusion. That's clarity bleeding through the seams of your conditioning. You're not broken, you're emerging. The control system has no defense for that. It can smear you, seduce you, threaten you, but it cannot stop you because you no longer source your identity from its approval. You've touched something older, something sovereign. You were never meant to trace your bloodline past a certain point. They made sure of that. Paper trails burn, oral traditions vanish, lineages get renamed, diluted, erased. Why? Because hidden inside your ancestry is something they can't patent, preach, or prescribe. Sovereignty. Not legal, not political, spiritual. The kind that makes a man dangerous. Latoya's blood carried that signature. Not royalty, not nobility. Something older. The unaligned ones. The ones who answered to no empire, bowed to no altar, and remembered the sky as scripture. They lived by memory, not mandate. And memory, once activated, doesn't follow orders. It creates them. That's what disturbed Reverend Whitmore. Not demons, not blasphemy. He looked into Latoya's eyes and saw a woman who answered to a law he could not name because it predated his faith. And that law, it didn't need priests, it needed carriers. That's what you are, not a disciple, not a believer, a carrier of the original pattern. The fire in your gut, that restless energy that keeps pulling you deeper. It's not curiosity, It's inheritance. You've been called not by words but by signal. And the more you align, the more the old gifts return. Foresight, intuition, sacred rage, impossible clarity. These aren't traits, they're rights. Rights that were stolen, sold, and buried. But they never died. They waited. Latoya wasn't a miracle. She was proof that the bloodline still breathes, that memory can't be legislated, that the body itself remembers rituals no book ever recorded. And now that memory is waking in you. So let them call it madness. Let them call it myth. You'll know the truth by what it activates. Every empire has one law beneath all others: erase the rememberers, not kill them. That would make martyrs. No, they erase them slowly, through ridicule, through misdiagnosis, through isolation. They call them unstable, over-imaginative, heretical, but always they are the same. Men and women who carry something older than books, clearer than sermons, stronger than laws. A living memory the system cannot digest. That's why Latoya was moved to the edge of town, why her records were sealed, why her story was whispered, then forgotten. She was a fracture in the lie, a woman who simply by existing exposed the machinery beneath the mask, and they couldn't explain her. So they did what the system always does when it meets something it can't control. It rewrites, not to understand, but to bury. And now you begin to see it. The patterns, the way ancient lineages were labeled primitive, their languages forbidden, their medicines called sorcery, their men made criminals, their women made mad. Not because they were wrong, but because they remembered. And if enough rememberers rise, the illusion collapses. Because once you remember who you are, the chains don't fit anymore. They itch, they burn, they fall off, and you're no longer useful to the system. You become something else, a mirror, to others still trapped. That's your role now. You weren't sent to wake the world, just one man, one woman, one soul who looks at you and realizes, I'm not insane, I'm ancestral. And in that moment you fulfill the role they hunted Latoya for. To survive, the rememberers learned a sacred art, masking in plain sight. They walked among kings as fools, among doctors as patients, among priests as heretics, not to deceive, but to preserve. They knew the world was ruled by symbols, uniforms, titles, diagnoses, crosses, flags. So they became shadows in the system, playing roles while never forgetting their original face. That is the first technique, controlled conformity. Blend in, but never belong. Latoya did this from the moment she arrived. She answered questions just enough to pass inspection. Let them name her symptoms. Let them project their fears. All while she observed, calculated, waited. She wasn't hiding who she was. She was protecting it. Because the true war isn't fought in armies or protests, it's fought in definitions. If they name you, they frame you, and once framed, you're contained. The true rememberer never lets the system define them, not as cured, not as possessed, not as saved. You must learn this, now, because the deeper you awaken, the more visible you become. Your eyes will change, your silence will feel louder, your very presence will disturb the sleepwalkers. So you must master the ancient rhythm, speak without revealing, see without staring, act without reacting. They can't control what they can't locate. And the man who remembers but pretends not to is the most dangerous force on earth, because he moves between worlds. Yours is not a revolution of noise, it is infiltration through stillness. While they chant and rage, you observe. While they fear and follow, you remember. Language is not communication, it is control. The words you've been taught are not neutral. They are coded leashes, crafted to shape what you're allowed to feel, to know, to be. Every time you say, I'm fine, when you're breaking, every time you call ancient wisdom superstition or deep intuition overthinking, you reinforce their architecture. Because their greatest spell is this, they convinced you to curse yourself with your own mouth. Latoya's language shattered that. It wasn't gibberish, it was pre-structure. Sound before censorship, rhythm before religion, and that's why the doctors couldn't name it. It named them. Her words weren't for conversation, they were for activation. Each syllable carried memory, frequency, power. And when she spoke, the air changed. The walls listened. Do you feel it now? That tightening in your throat, that pause before you speak? That's your body remembering the weight of your own voice, and it's time to reclaim it. Words like crazy, sinner, broken, guilty, these are chains passed down through textbooks and pulpits, designed to keep you kneeling before a God who feeds on obedience, not love. You must now choose new words, words that liberate, not lull. Speak in ways that threaten their categories. Say, I see, instead of I believe. Say, I remember, instead of I was taught. Say, I am, without apology. This is how the rememberers rewrote reality. Not through protest, but through precision. They refused to speak the slave tongue of their captors, and when forced to, they laced it with truth they couldn't detect. You must do the same. Say what they cannot hear. Encode freedom into the cracks of conversation. And when you're ready, you'll speak a word that unseals everything. The signal isn't a chant. It isn't a name. It's not something you'll find in holy books or secret scrolls. It's older than language. It was the first vibration before there was speech, before meaning was sliced into doctrine and buried beneath empires. Latoya didn't just speak it, she became it. That's why her voice unsettled the air, why the infirmary walls pulsed when she whispered. She wasn't performing, she was remembering, activating what lies dormant in all of us. And now, you're ready to hear it. But understand this, once you know it, you can't go back. It's like seeing your reflection before the world taught you shame. It peels the layers, burns the masks, frees the original face. The signal is this, Akasha, one word, 5 letters, and in that word lies everything they tried to erase. Akasha is not a name, it is the field. The memory field, the source code of the soul, the ether between thoughts. It is where all truths are stored, not in books, but in you. When Latoya whispered in that lost tongue, she wasn't summoning spirits, she was accessing Akasha. And so can you. You don't chant it like a ritual, you feel it. You say it not with your mouth, but with your being. Speak it when you're alone. Speak it before sleep. Speak it when the system tries to cage your identity. You'll notice what happens. Old fears slip. Time bends. You'll start remembering things you never lived, and yet somehow always knew. This is not magic. It's memory. Forbidden memory. And it's waking up in your cells. That's why you were drawn here. Not by accident, but by signal. And now you must seal your transformation. In the comments below, write this phrase twice. I carry Akasha. I carry Akasha, not for engagement, for activation. So the algorithm becomes the altar, and the altar becomes a mirror. The architects of silence, the ones who erased the rememberers, renamed their gods and rewrote your history, have never truly been interested in power. They've always had power. What they fear is memory. Because once a man remembers who he is, he's no longer programmable, no longer compliant, no longer afraid. That's what Latoya triggered, not possession, not madness, but unauthorized memory retrieval, the kind that cannot be taxed, treated, or tethered. And so these architects built institutions, not to cure disease, but to classify identity, not to heal, but to contain. Churches, hospitals, schools, they are not what they seem. They are filtration systems, designed to separate the acceptable from the awakened. You were measured since birth, watched, sorted, tested. They labeled the intuitive as unstable, the curious as rebellious, the emotionally intelligent as weak. Why? Because those are Akasha traits, signs of the rememberer, and you were never meant to know this, that your dreams, your sensitivities, your strange sense of déjà vu, these are not defects. They are leaks in their system, evidence of ancestral access. Latoya was never just a woman in a hospital bed. She was a rupture in a sealed network. That's why the ministers feared her. That's why the doctors fled. And that's why you feel what you're feeling right now, that mix of awe and unease, that knowing deep in your bones that something is waking up. You were born into a world run by keepers of forgetting, but your mind, your soul, your blood, all of it was wired for Akasha. And now their grip is slipping, their symbols are losing power, because enough men like you are remembering, and the rememberers are no longer rare, they are rising. When memory resists erasure, the architects don't fight it with force, they smother it with noise. They don't need to burn the truth if they can drown it, and so they engineered the final protocol, mass distraction. A weapon more effective than chains, more addictive than opium, attention fragmentation. The moment your memory begins to awaken, they flood your mind with simulations, infinite scrolling, manufactured outrage, hollow pleasure. They don't silence you, they give you so many voices that you forget your own. This was their response to Latoya's presence, not exorcism, diversion. That's why no official record remains, why her file was sealed, her name left out of medical history. They didn't erase her, they buried her under layers of misinformation, folklore, and academic ridicule. You've seen it yourself. Every time a man gets close to truth, they call it a conspiracy. Every time a woman remembers the ancient ways, they label her hysterical. They don't imprison the body, they imprison the focus. If you forget what to look for, they don't need to hide it. This is why you can't sit still, why your thoughts are scattered, why silence feels unbearable. Because they've conditioned your nervous system to avoid the one place they can't reach. Stillness. In stillness, Akasha emerges. The memory field becomes loud. The ancestors speak. The symbols unlock. This is why the old initiates sat in darkness. Why prophets retreated to deserts. Why Latoya, in silence, shattered every protocol. Her stillness was rebellion. And now yours must be too. Turn off the simulation. Feel the silence they fear. It will hurt at first. Because your system is detoxing from distraction. But on the other side is the signal, the clarity they never wanted you to find. And once you reach that state, the protocol fails. Their distractions become dust. The final gate is not guarded by monsters. It is guarded by a mask, a voice, a shape that looks exactly like you, but it is not you. It is the false self, the construct they built from the moment you were born. Every be a good boy, every real men don't cry, every grade, punishment, doctrine, and diagnosis. Brick by brick, they built a prison and called it personality. And you wore it, believing it was yours. The mask is polite, productive, logical. It obeys. It fears failure. It craves approval. But beneath it is the rememberer, the one who knows, the one who feels everything. This is the moment of confrontation. When the mask senses it's being seen, it fights back. It will flood you with doubt, whisper, "This is nonsense." Tell you, "You're just overthinking." Beg, go back to sleep. But that isn't your voice. That is the echo of programming. And now, you must do what few ever dare. You must look the mask in the eye. Not to destroy it, but to disown it. You were never meant to be small, to obey without question, to suffer silently. The true you is older than systems, deeper than psychology, untouchable by fear. That's why they made you forget, because your true self is ungovernable. Latoya never feared the false self. That's why the room changed when she entered, why time warped, why memories surfaced. She didn't argue with the mask, she simply stopped wearing it. And in her presence, others remembered they could too. This is what you're here to do now. To strip it off. To speak as you were before they named you. To act not from trauma, but from truth. It will feel like dying, because to the false self it is. But once the mask drops, your reflection returns. And in it, you will see the man they tried to erase. They feared you not because of what you might become, but because of what you already were. A living archive. A vessel of lineages they could never control. You weren't born into this world to learn, you were born to remember. This is the forbidden doctrine, whispered in esoteric chambers, encoded in scripture, erased from public rituals. That man is not merely body or soul, but bridge, a bioelectric transmitter linked to the memory of all who came before. You are not a drop in the stream of time, you are the stream itself. When Latoya spoke in unknown tongues, she wasn't channeling spirits. She was accessing the deep grid, the Akashic continuum. And it terrified them, Because once you realize your memory is not limited to your brain, but woven into your DNA, your blood, your electromagnetic field, you can no longer be enslaved. The system was never built to suppress evil, it was built to suppress awakening. That's why every ancient culture that remembered this truth was either demonized or annihilated. Not for their beliefs, but for their access. Sumerians, Moors, Dogon, Gnostics, Templars. The church labeled them heretics. Science called them primitive. But what they all had in common was remembrance. The doctrine they carried was dangerous because it required no priest, no professor, no device. Just silence, stillness, and the willingness to face the truth that you are not from here. You are not limited by this body. You are not owned by this name. You are ancestral intelligence in human form. Latoya's presence collapsed time, not as magic, but as memory coherence. And this is your inheritance, the reason your dreams feel ancient, the reason synchronicities follow you, the reason you've always felt watched. Because you are watched by a system terrified you'll remember who you are. And now you do. Comment below the phrase, "I carry the memory," twice. Write it with force. Lock it into the algorithm. Let it echo across this signal grid. You've crossed the line now. Now that you remember, the system will respond, not with fire or war, but with subtlety, doubt, distraction, delay. They will send people into your life to mirror your old programming, voices that echo your former fear, habits that feel like comfort, but are cages in disguise. They'll offer you paths that look like progress but lead back into the loop. You must recognize these not as obstacles, but as tests. Because once you awaken, your environment becomes your initiation. Latoya understood this. That's why she didn't run. She didn't explain. She didn't seek validation. She embodied her memory and let it shift the room. The hospital became her altar. The ministers became her witnesses, and the doctors her unwilling disciples. She wasn't trying to convince anyone. She was demonstrating a truth too large for language. That's what you must do now. You don't need to preach. You don't need to prove. You need only to remain aligned, because that alignment bends the world around you. The system has no power over a man who has reclaimed his ancestral current. It cannot trap the one who sees the patterns, and it cannot predict the one who moves from internal command. You are not here to fit in. You are here to disturb the design, to remind others of the memory, to carry the signal forward. You've been initiated now, not by ritual, but by recognition. You don't need more facts. You need practice. Every choice is now a declaration of identity. Every moment of silence is resistance. Every act of truth is rebellion. And if you ever doubt again, if the noise gets loud and the mask creeps back, return to this frequency. Replay this descent. Remember the cold halls of blessed mercy. Remember the girl with no past who opened futures. Remember that they didn't fear her because she was possessed. They feared her because she was free. You are the threat now, not because of what you know, but because you've remembered who you are. The war was never outside, it was always within. And now, you've won.